Clara Bennett was 31 years old, homeless after the ruthless Iron Ridge Transit Company forced her from the small boarding house she had managed for nearly a decade, accusing her of unpaid debts created by forged contracts she had never signed. With only $5 wrapped inside a worn handkerchief and tucked safely into her weathered leather satchel, she walked into the county auction at Redstone Crossing and spent every last coin buying an abandoned stagecoach depot that everyone else considered worthless. The old depot had stood empty for almost 20 years, its roof sagging, its windows broken, and its reputation buried beneath dust and forgotten memories. The townspeople laughed as she accepted the deed, convinced she had traded her final chance at survival for a collapsing building that would never earn another dollar. Yet beneath the faded beams of the attic rested something sealed away by the town's final honest sheriff, a forgotten ledger capable of exposing decades of corruption, restoring stolen fortunes, and giving an entire frontier community the justice it had quietly lost. Before another week had passed, powerful men would begin searching for the very secret Clara had unknowingly purchased for $5. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Bennett. If you're watching from a place that has ever been overlooked or underestimated, tell us where you're joining us from in the comments. Clara Bennett grew up believing that every journey left behind something worth remembering. Her father, Thomas Bennett, drove the western stagecoach route between Redstone Crossing and Silver Creek for nearly 25 years. He knew every bend in the dusty trails, every river crossing, every mountain pass, and nearly every family living between the two settlements. Travelers often remembered Thomas because he never hurried frightened passengers through dangerous country. Instead, he told stories. During long rides beneath endless prairie skies, he spoke about courage, kindness, and the quiet people who built the frontier without ever expecting their names to appear in history books. Clara spent much of her childhood sitting beside him atop the stagecoach whenever school allowed, watching wild horses race across distant grasslands, while learning that every stranger carried a story no one else had taken the time to hear. Her mother, Eleanor Bennett, operated the small dining room inside the old Redstone Stagecoach depot, preparing hot meals for exhausted travelers arriving after days of rough roads and unpredictable weather. She welcomed wealthy businessmen and penniless settlers with exactly the same warm smile, believing that hunger erased social status long before kindness restored it. Clara helped wash dishes, sweep the wooden floors, and refill coffee cups from the time she could barely reach the counters. By the age of 12, she knew dozens of regular travelers by name, remembered their favorite meals, and listened carefully whenever older people shared stories about the frontier's earliest days. The depot itself fascinated her more than anything else. Built from thick pine beams and native stone, it had once been the busiest place in Redstone Crossing. Wagons arrived before sunrise, horses thundered into the stable yard throughout the day, and lanterns glowed warmly from every window long after darkness settled across the prairie. Above the waiting room sat a spacious attic filled with old trunks, broken furniture, weathered saddles, forgotten freight crates, and stacks of dusty records no one had examined for years. Thomas occasionally climbed into the attic searching for spare harnesses or replacement wagon parts, but he always smiled whenever Clara asked if she could explore with him. One day, he would say, "When you're old enough to appreciate old things instead of playing with them." Clara promised she would wait, though every creaking floorboard above seemed to whisper forgotten stories, waiting patiently beneath layers of dust. Every evening after the final stagecoach departed, Thomas gathered Clara outside beneath the wide western sky while stable hands settled horses for the night. He often pointed toward the fading road disappearing over distant hills. "People think a journey ends where the road stops," he quietly told her one autumn evening. "But the most important part usually begins after everyone else believes the story is over." Clara never forgot those words. She carried them through childhood without fully understanding them, never imagining they would someday lead her back to the abandoned depot everyone else had already written off forever. Margaret Ellis, the elderly widow who owned the depot before Eleanor, often told Clara that buildings remembered people better than people remembered buildings. Whenever rain drummed softly across the cedar shingles, or winter winds rattled the old window panes, Margaret would sit beside the large stone fireplace with a cup of tea and tell stories about the earliest days of Redstone Crossing. She spoke of settlers who arrived with little more than determination, of stagecoach drivers who carried medicine through blizzards because someone miles away desperately needed it, and of Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks, a quiet lawman respected not because he carried the fastest revolver, but because every person in the territory believed his word without question. Clara listened with complete fascination. While other children dreamed about becoming wealthy ranch owners or famous explorers, she dreamed about preserving the stories hidden inside ordinary places before time quietly erased them forever. Thomas encouraged that curiosity. Whenever travelers left behind old newspapers, worn maps, faded journals, or broken pocket watches they no longer wanted, he allowed Clara to keep them instead of throwing them away. She carefully cleaned every item before placing it inside neatly labeled wooden boxes. Eleanor often laughed whenever another forgotten object appeared beneath Clara's bed. "One day," she teased, "you'll own more memories than furniture." Clara always smiled. Memories last longer. Those simple habits gradually shaped the young woman she became. By 16, she could repair cracked leather luggage, restore faded account books, organize years of freight records, and recognize handwriting from dozens of regular travelers. The depot became more than a business. It became the living heart of the town. Ranchers exchanged news beside its fireplace. Families reunited beneath its porch. Newly arrived settlers found their first warm meal there before building homes of their own. Clara loved every part of it, especially the quiet moments after sunset, when the final horses had been fed and lantern light reflected softly across polished wooden floors. During those peaceful evenings, Thomas sometimes climbed into the attic, searching for supplies, while Clara organized paperwork downstairs. One autumn night he returned carrying a dusty leather-bound record book tied with faded blue ribbon. "Look what I found buried behind an old wardrobe," he said. Clara eagerly reached for it, but Thomas gently smiled and placed it back upon the shelf. "Not tonight," she laughed. "You always say that." Thomas nodded. "Because every old record belongs to someone until we know otherwise." Eleanor overheard the conversation while wiping tables. "Your father believes forgotten things deserve respect before curiosity." Thomas chuckled. "Exactly." Clara sighed dramatically, but secretly admired his restraint. He never opened another person's letters, never discarded old belongings carelessly, and never assumed abandoned objects had lost their value simply because everyone else ignored them. Those lessons quietly settled inside her character, year after year. Life in Redstone Crossing seemed almost timeless. Seasons arrived exactly when expected. Spring filled the hills with wildflowers while stagecoaches splashed through swollen creeks carrying hopeful settlers westward. Summers brought bustling trade, laughter spilling from the depot porch, and children chasing wagon wheels through dusty streets. Autumn painted cottonwood trees gold before winter wrapped the valley beneath soft blankets of snow. Every season brought different travelers, yet the depot remained the place where every journey briefly paused before continuing. Clara grew into a capable young woman, admired for her calm spirit rather than loud ambition. Travelers frequently requested her help because she remembered names, destinations, and forgotten belongings with astonishing accuracy. "Miss Bennett never forgets anyone," merchants often remarked. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks himself occasionally stopped by after long patrols to drink coffee beside the fireplace before returning to duty. He rarely spoke about his investigations, yet Thomas trusted him completely. More than once, Clara noticed the sheriff quietly placing official record books inside a locked cabinet behind the depot office before riding away again. She assumed those books simply contained freight records or county paperwork. Nathaniel never explained further, and Thomas never asked. Trust required remarkably few words between honest people. Everything began changing when the railroad finally reached neighboring counties. Investors arrived wearing expensive coats and carrying promises of prosperity. Among them stood the executives of Iron Ridge Transit Company, who announced plans to replace nearly every long-distance stagecoach route with modern rail service. Many towns celebrated the announcement. Faster travel promised larger markets and greater profits. Few people noticed what quietly disappeared alongside the old coaches. Within only a few years, passenger traffic through the depot declined sharply. Freight wagons followed the railroad instead of dusty prairie roads. Businesses that once depended upon stagecoach travel slowly closed their doors. Thomas accepted the changes without bitterness. "Progress isn't the enemy," he often reminded Clara. "People forgetting their promises usually are." Those words puzzled her until company representatives began purchasing older buildings throughout town at remarkably low prices. The depot remained one of the few properties they could not acquire because Eleanor still held its ownership papers after Margaret retired. Iron Ridge officials visited repeatedly, offering generous sums for the aging building. Eleanor politely refused every offer. "The depot isn't just timber," she explained. "It's part of this town." The representatives always smiled before leaving. Yet with each visit, their smiles seemed slightly less friendly. Clara noticed something else. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks also began visiting the depot more frequently during those years. Sometimes he arrived late at night carrying small bundles of county documents wrapped carefully in canvas. He always climbed quietly into the attic alone, before returning downstairs several minutes later. Once, curiosity nearly overcame Clara as she watched him descend the narrow staircase, brushing dust from his sleeves. Nathaniel noticed her watching and smiled gently. Some things need a safe place until the right day arrives. Clara almost asked what he meant. Instead, she simply nodded. Years later, she would remember those exact words while standing inside the same forgotten attic, realizing the sheriff had quietly trusted the old Stagecoach depot with far more than anyone in Redstone Crossing had ever imagined. The first real crack in Clara Bennett's peaceful life appeared so quietly that almost no one in Redstone Crossing recognized it for what it truly was. One spring morning, an Iron Ridge Transit Company accountant arrived carrying a polished leather briefcase and several neatly prepared contracts. He smiled warmly, praised Eleanor's reputation, admired the old depot, and spoke at length about partnership rather than ownership. According to him, the company simply wished to lease a small storage room while rail construction continued farther west. The arrangement seemed harmless. Eleanor politely declined anyway. "We've never rented part of the depot," she explained kindly. "Travelers need every room." The accountant accepted her decision with surprising grace. He tipped his hat, thanked her for the conversation, and rode away without argument. Thomas watched him disappear down the road before quietly saying that a man who left that easily usually planned to come back another way. Clara remembered those words because her father rarely judged strangers, and when he did, experience almost always proved him right. Over the following months, company officials returned again and again, each visit carrying a slightly different proposal. Sometimes they offered generous sums of money. Sometimes they suggested partnerships that promised prosperity. Other times they warned politely that maintaining such an old building would become increasingly expensive as stagecoach traffic continued declining across the territory. Eleanor never changed her answer. She calmly reminded every representative that the depot belonged to the town as much as it belonged to the Bennett family, and that as long as travelers still arrived, someone should always be there to welcome them. The officials always smiled before leaving, yet every smile seemed colder than the last. Business gradually slowed. Fewer coaches arrived each week. The once busy stable yard often stood nearly empty by afternoon. Freight wagons increasingly followed the expanding railroad instead of dusty frontier roads. Several neighboring businesses closed altogether, their owners moving toward larger railroad towns in search of opportunity. Even so, Clara refused to believe the depot had lost its purpose. Travelers still came. Ranchers still gathered around Eleanor's supper table each evening. Children still waited eagerly on the porch whenever they heard distant horses approaching across the prairie. The depot no longer bustled as it once had, yet its warmth remained unchanged. Then sorrow arrived before hardship. Thomas accepted one final long-distance stagecoach route through Blackstone Pass after another driver unexpectedly fell ill. The journey normally required 4 days. 5 days passed without any sign of him. On the 6th morning, another driver returned instead, carrying Thomas Bennett's weathered hat in trembling hands. A sudden rockslide had struck the narrow mountain road during heavy rain. Thomas had guided every passenger safely away from the overturned coach before the remaining hillside collapsed around him. Every passenger survived. Thomas did not. The entire town attended his funeral. Ranchers traveled more than 50 miles simply to stand beside Eleanor and Clara beneath the old cottonwood trees overlooking Redstone Crossing. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks quietly removed his silver badge before placing it gently upon Thomas's coffin for a single silent moment. No speech could adequately describe the kind of man Thomas Bennett had been. His absence spoke loudly enough on its own. Life afterward seemed strangely quieter. Without Thomas's steady optimism, the depot felt larger, emptier, almost unfamiliar. Clara worked longer hours beside Eleanor, determined that grief would never become an excuse for neglect. Together they repaired wagons, balanced accounts, cooked meals, cleaned guest rooms, and welcomed every traveler with exactly the same kindness Thomas had always shown. The work exhausted them, yet it also protected them. Busy hands often delayed aching hearts. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks continued stopping by from time to time, though something about him had changed. He appeared increasingly troubled, often studying the depot windows before entering, as though making certain no one had followed him. One rainy evening, he arrived well after sunset, carrying another bundle wrapped carefully in heavy canvas. "Miss Eleanor," he said quietly, "may I borrow your attic for a few minutes?" Eleanor smiled warmly. "You never have to ask." Nathaniel climbed upstairs alone. This time, Clara noticed something different. He remained there nearly half an hour. When he finally returned, fine dust covered both sleeves of his coat, yet he carried nothing in his hands. As he reached the front door, he paused beside Clara and lowered his voice. "If anyone ever tells you this old building has no value," he said softly, "don't believe them too quickly." Before Clara could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and disappeared into the rain. It became the last conversation she ever had with Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks. Only 3 weeks later, the entire territory learned he had resigned unexpectedly. Official reports claimed poor health forced his retirement. Few believed the explanation. Within months, he vanished completely. Some claimed he had traveled east to live with relatives. Others insisted he died somewhere beyond the mountains. No one truly knew. Without Nathaniel Brooks, Redstone Crossing slowly changed. The new sheriff answered more readily to businessmen than ordinary ranchers. County records suddenly became difficult for citizens to inspect. Long-settled property boundaries began shifting mysteriously. Families who had owned grazing land for decades discovered paperwork claiming forgotten debts or unpaid taxes. Several lost everything after hurried court hearings few townspeople even knew were taking place. Whenever frightened neighbors sought help, Iron Ridge representatives somehow always appeared offering to purchase their land before foreclosure became official. Thomas's earlier warning echoed constantly inside Clara's memory. Progress had never been the enemy. People forgetting their promises usually were. 2 years after Thomas's death, illness quietly claimed Eleanor as well. Long hours, endless work, and grief slowly weakened her heart until even climbing the depot stairs left her breathless. She never complained. Instead, she spent her final weeks teaching Clara every remaining detail about the business. She explained suppliers, introduced trusted ranchers, reviewed account books, showed her where every spare key hung, and reminded her that every traveler deserved kindness regardless of wealth. On her final evening, she gently placed both hands around Clara's and whispered that the building was never truly theirs because they owned it. It belonged to them because people trusted it. Clara fought back tears and promised she would protect it. Eleanor smiled peacefully and said she already knew. She passed away quietly before sunrise. For the first time in her life, Clara stood completely alone, yet she kept her promise. Every morning she unlocked the depot before dawn. Every evening she extinguished the lanterns after the final traveler departed. She repaired loose floorboards herself, cooked every meal, balanced every account, and welcomed strangers exactly as Eleanor always had. The townspeople admired her determination. Unfortunately, someone else had begun admiring the depot itself. One crisp autumn morning, 2 company lawyers arrived, carrying official county documents. Their expressions revealed neither sympathy nor hesitation. One unfolded a thick packet of papers and calmly announced that according to county records, the property had been pledged as security against unpaid commercial loans exceeding $4,000. Clara stared at him in disbelief. She insisted such loans had never existed. The lawyer quietly handed her the documents. Every page appeared official. Every government seal looked genuine. Her own signature appeared repeatedly across loan agreements she had never seen before. She insisted the signatures had been forged. The lawyer merely replied that the county recorder disagreed. Clara hurried immediately to the recorder's office, carrying Eleanor's original ownership papers. The clerk refused to examine them, insisting the case had already been settled. She appealed before the county magistrate. The hearing lasted less than 15 minutes. Iron Ridge presented the forged contracts. Clara presented the original deeds. The magistrate barely glanced at them before ruling in favor of the company. Within 7 days, the depot legally belonged to Iron Ridge Transit Company. Within 8 days, Clara received formal eviction papers ordering her to leave the only home she had ever truly known. She packed quietly, not because she accepted the judgment, but because no one remained willing to hear the truth. As she carried her final satchel onto the porch, she turned for one last look. Sunlight filtered gently through the familiar windows. The stable stood silent. The dining room tables remained exactly where Eleanor had left them. Every memory still lived inside those weathered walls. Only Clara had been forced outside them. She walked away carrying little more than $5, several family photographs, Thomas's old pocket knife, and the quiet conviction that somewhere beneath all the carefully forged papers, the real truth still existed. She simply did not yet know that the truth had never left the old Stagecoach depot at all. It had been waiting patiently above everyone's heads, inside the forgotten attic. The county auction attracted fewer people than Clara expected. Most of those gathered inside the courthouse had come hoping to purchase grazing parcels, abandoned barns, or storage buildings that might still produce income. Hardly anyone paid attention when the auctioneer reached the final listing near the bottom of his worn ledger. Lot 32, he announced in a tired voice. Former Redstone Stagecoach Depot. Includes stable yard, freight office, main building, and attic storage. Opening bid, $5. A ripple of laughter drifted across the room. One rancher leaned toward another and muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. $5 is too much for a place filled with broken windows and mice. Another bidder shook his head. The railroad buried that depot years ago. Several businessmen barely looked up from their conversations. To them, the old building represented nothing except expensive repairs and memories that could never earn another dollar. Clara quietly reached inside her worn satchel and wrapped her fingers around the 5 silver coins tied carefully inside Eleanor's faded handkerchief. Every coin represented everything she still possessed. If she spent them now, she would leave the courthouse with no money for food, lodging, or tomorrow. Yet something deep inside refused to let the depot disappear into strangers' hands. She remembered Thomas standing proudly beside arriving stagecoaches. She remembered Eleanor greeting exhausted travelers with warm bread and fresh coffee. She remembered Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks climbing quietly into the attic, carrying mysterious bundles no one else ever questioned. Most of all, she remembered his final words. If anyone ever tells you this old building has no value, don't believe them too quickly. The auctioneer looked around the room. Do I have an opening bid? Silence answered him. Clara slowly stood. Every face turned toward her. $5, she said calmly. The room became unusually quiet before scattered chuckles broke the silence. A merchant sitting near the front laughed openly. She's buying her own eviction. Someone farther back added, poor girl finally lost what little sense she had left. Even the auctioneer seemed surprised. He looked around once more. Any higher bids? No one spoke. Going once. Silence. Going twice. Still nothing. His gavel struck the desk with a sharp crack. Ah, sold. $5 to Miss Clara Bennett. Clara stepped forward and placed Eleanor's handkerchief upon the table. One by one, she unfolded the cloth and counted the 5 silver dollars into the auctioneer's waiting hand. When he handed her the deed, the paper felt strangely heavier than its thin pages should have allowed. Outside the courthouse, several townspeople watched curiously as she emerged carrying the rolled document beneath her arm. Mrs. Whitmore, who had known Clara since childhood, hurried toward her. Clara, she asked gently, why would you spend your last money on that old place? Clara looked toward the distant edge of town, where the abandoned depot still stood beyond overgrown cottonwood trees. Because everyone else only remembers how it ended. Mrs. Whitmore frowned thoughtfully. And you? Clara smiled softly. I remember how it began. The older woman squeezed her hand before quietly pressing a small loaf of homemade bread into Clara's satchel. You'll need supper tonight. Clara thanked her and began the long walk toward the depot. The farther she traveled from the courthouse, the quieter the world became. Railroad whistles echoed faintly from the newer station across town, while abandoned wagon ruts gradually replaced the busier streets. Tall weeds lined the forgotten road leading toward the depot. Cottonwood branches stretched across the path as though nature itself had slowly begun reclaiming the property. When the weathered building finally appeared through the trees, Clara stopped walking. Time had been unkind to it. Several front windows stood broken. Paint had almost completely disappeared from the old pine siding. Part of the stable roof had collapsed beneath years of winter snow. The once proud Stagecoach sign hanging above the entrance leaned crookedly from a single rusted chain, swaying gently whenever the prairie wind passed through. Yet beneath the neglect, she immediately recognized something others had overlooked. The foundation remained perfectly level. The heavy stone walls showed almost no cracking. The great hand-hewn beams supporting the porch still stood remarkably straight, despite decades without care. Whoever built the depot had expected it to outlive generations. Clara unlocked the weathered front door, using the small iron key included with the deed. The hinges groaned loudly before surrendering. Cool air drifted outward, carrying familiar scents she thought she had lost forever. Aged pine boards, cold stone, leather, dust, dried coffee beans trapped inside forgotten barrels, and faint traces of fireplace smoke lingering deep within the walls themselves. She closed her eyes for a long moment. It felt less like entering an abandoned building than returning home after an impossibly long journey. Sunlight streamed through broken windows, revealing thousands of floating dust particles dancing gently inside the empty waiting room. The long wooden benches remained exactly where travelers had once rested. The ticket counter still stood against the far wall beneath shelves that had once held schedules, freight records, and passenger manifests. Cobwebs stretched between lantern hooks hanging from the ceiling, yet beneath the dust Clara could still see the careful craftsmanship Thomas had admired throughout her childhood. She spent the remainder of the afternoon opening windows, sweeping broken glass, and carrying fallen branches away from the porch. Every stroke of the broom uncovered another memory. Here Eleanor once welcomed frightened immigrant families arriving from distant territories. There Thomas had laughed with fellow drivers after safely completing another dangerous winter route. Beside the fireplace, Clara herself had listened to Margaret Ellis tell stories about Redstone Crossing, before railroads, before land companies, before greed quietly rewrote history. By sunset, one corner of the waiting room appeared almost welcoming again. Clara lit an old lantern she discovered hanging beside the office door. To her surprise, it still worked after a little fresh oil and careful cleaning. Warm golden light filled the room, pushing darkness gently back toward the corners. She ate Mrs. Whitmore's bread beside the cold fireplace while listening to the wind move softly around the old building. For the first time since losing the depot months earlier, she felt something she had nearly forgotten: peace. As night settled across the prairie, Clara decided to inspect the second floor before sleeping. She carried the lantern slowly up the narrow staircase that creaked beneath every careful step. The guest room stood empty except for broken furniture and faded curtains drifting gently through shattered window panes. At the far end of the hallway, another smaller staircase climbed toward the attic Thomas had always promised she could explore one day. Dust covered every step. No footprints disturbed the thick gray layer, except remarkably old ones almost swallowed by time itself. Clara lifted the lantern higher and slowly climbed. The attic stretched wider than she remembered from childhood glimpses through the trapdoor. Moonlight filtered through narrow roof vents while heavy oak beams crossed high overhead. Broken trunks, freight crates, worn harnesses, cracked wagon wheels, and stacks of forgotten ledgers filled much of the enormous space beneath the roof. Everything rested beneath decades of dust, exactly as though the building itself had quietly frozen in time. Clara walked carefully between the old storage piles until her lantern illuminated something unexpected near the far western wall. Hidden beneath a faded army blanket stood a tall wooden bookcase, unlike anything else inside the attic. Every other shelf in the room sagged with age. This one remained perfectly square. More curious still, someone had recently wiped away just enough dust from one corner to reveal a polished brass handle fastened to its side. Clara frowned. That made no sense. No one had entered the attic for years. Slowly, she knelt beside the bookcase and brushed away more dust with her fingertips. The floor beneath it showed faint scrape marks running toward the wall. The shelf had moved before, not recently, but many years ago. Her heartbeat quickened. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks had visited this attic countless times before disappearing forever. Thomas had once found a mysterious record book hidden behind old furniture here. Nathaniel himself had warned her never to believe anyone who claimed the depot held no value. Clara carefully grasped the brass handle and pulled gently. The heavy bookcase refused to move. She tried pushing instead. It shifted barely half an inch before stopping with a deep wooden groan. Somewhere behind it, something solid answered, with a hollow echo unlike the surrounding walls. Clara immediately froze. Behind the bookcase, there was empty space. Clara remained kneeling beside the heavy bookcase, scarcely breathing, as the hollow sound echoed once more behind the old pine wall. Every instinct urged her to force the shelf aside immediately, yet Thomas Bennett had spent an entire childhood teaching her that haste often destroyed the very answers patience hoped to uncover. She slowly released the brass handle and lifted the lantern higher instead. Warm golden light revealed details she had overlooked moments earlier. The tall bookcase was not actually attached to the wall. It rested upon narrow wooden runners carefully built into the attic floor. Decades of dust concealed them almost perfectly, but once she brushed the surface with her hand, two parallel grooves became clearly visible beneath the accumulated dirt. Someone had designed the shelf to slide, not to store books, to hide something. Clara carefully examined the surrounding woodwork. Every other beam inside the attic had darkened naturally with age. The timber immediately surrounding the bookcase remained slightly lighter, as though countless hands had touched it long after the rest of the room had been forgotten. Whoever built the mechanism expected it to be used repeatedly. She smiled quietly to herself. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks had never climbed into this attic simply to admire old furniture. He had been protecting something. She climbed downstairs and searched the depot until she found an old pry bar hanging beside Thomas's forgotten tool bench in the stable. The familiar wooden handle still bore the small initials he had carved years earlier. Returning to the attic, Clara carefully cleaned years of hardened dust from the runners before applying a little wagon grease she discovered inside an old supply chest. She waited patiently, allowing the grease to soak into the dry wood exactly as Thomas would have done. Only then did she place both hands against the side of the tall bookcase. This time it moved farther. Slowly, reluctantly. The heavy shelf groaned, as though awakening from a very long sleep. Dust drifted through the lantern light, while old wooden joints protested every inch of movement. Gradually, the bookcase slid sideways until a narrow opening appeared behind it. Clara raised the lantern toward the darkness. Hidden inside the wall stood a small, unfinished passage, scarcely wide enough for one person to enter. Cold air drifted gently from within, carrying the unmistakable scent of old cedar, aged leather, and paper untouched for many years. The space had been intentionally built between the attic wall and the outer roofline, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Clara stepped inside carefully. The hidden chamber measured perhaps 8 feet long and only 4 feet wide. Unlike the dusty attic beyond, this little room appeared remarkably clean. Thick cedar boards lined every wall, protecting whatever rested inside from moisture and insects. A narrow work table occupied one corner. Beside it stood an iron lantern bracket, a small wooden chair, and several empty shelves. Whoever created the chamber intended someone to work here in complete secrecy. Yet only one object remained. Resting quietly upon the table lay a worn black leather ledger, tied securely with faded blue ribbon. Beside it sat an old sheriff's badge wrapped carefully inside clean linen cloth. Clara's heartbeat quickened immediately. She recognized the badge. Though tarnished by time, the engraved lettering remained unmistakable. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks, Redstone County. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the ledger. The leather cover felt surprisingly well preserved. Embossed across the front in fading gold letters appeared a simple title. Private Investigation Record, N. Brooks. Clara stared silently at the book for several moments. The forgotten ledger Sheriff Brooks had guarded so carefully had been waiting inside the attic all along. Not lost, hidden, protected. She slowly untied the faded ribbon and opened the first page. The handwriting matched several official documents she remembered seeing inside the sheriff's office years before. The earliest entries described ordinary investigations: stolen cattle, missing horses, boundary disputes, freight robberies. But as Clara turned deeper into the book, the tone gradually changed. Entire pages became devoted to land transactions involving Iron Ridge Transit Company. Nathaniel had carefully copied names, dates, witness statements, bank transfers, survey corrections, and county filing numbers into astonishing detail. Certain names appeared repeatedly: County Recorder Edwin Mercer, Magistrate Roland Pierce, Surveyor Calvin Moore, Iron Ridge Attorney Silas Hargrove. Beside many entries, Nathaniel had written only 2 words: forgery confirmed. Clara continued reading, scarcely believing what unfolded before her eyes. Nathaniel had spent years quietly documenting an organized scheme through which wealthy investors systematically stole frontier property, by replacing original ownership records with expertly forged documents. Families who challenged the changes often lost their land through suspicious court rulings supported by falsified evidence. The company then purchased those properties for almost nothing before reselling them at enormous profit after the railroad expanded into the region. Clara suddenly understood what had happened to her own family. Eleanor's forged loan agreements had never been an isolated crime. They represented one small part of a much larger conspiracy stretching across several counties. Nathaniel Brooks had discovered the truth years before anyone else. She carefully turned another page. Folded inside the ledger rested several handwritten letters addressed to territorial investigators, who, according to Nathaniel's notes, never received them. Another envelope contained copies of original property maps proving dozens of official county surveys had been deliberately altered. Then Clara reached a page unlike every other in the book. Across the top, Nathaniel had written in unusually large letters, "If you are reading this, they found me before I could finish." Clara felt a chill move through the quiet room. She lowered herself slowly into the small wooden chair before continuing. Nathaniel explained that once he realized trusted officials participated in the fraud, he could no longer rely upon county courts. Witnesses began disappearing. Evidence vanished from government offices. Honest deputies quietly resigned without explanation. Even judges received incomplete records deliberately prepared to conceal the truth. Nathaniel wrote that he feared his investigation would die with him, unless someone outside the system eventually discovered the hidden chamber. He chose the old Stagecoach depot because few people ever questioned a sheriff visiting a transportation office after dark. Thomas Bennett unknowingly protected the secret simply by maintaining the building so faithfully. Nathaniel ended the letter with one final request. Do not use this ledger for revenge. Use it for restoration. Innocent families deserve their names returned before guilty men lose theirs. Justice should heal more lives than it wounds. Clara closed the book for a long moment, allowing the weight of those words to settle quietly inside her heart. Nathaniel Brooks had not hidden the ledger to destroy powerful people. He had preserved it to restore ordinary ones. That single difference explained everything about the man Thomas had respected so deeply. She looked around the hidden chamber once more. Above the little work table, someone had carved a single sentence into the cedar wall. Truth hidden is still truth. Clara gently smiled through gathering tears. You believed someone would come, she whispered softly into the silent room. Just then, a loud crash echoed from somewhere below inside the depot. Clara instantly extinguished the lantern. Every sound disappeared except the rapid beating of her own heart. Another noise followed, the unmistakable creak of the depot's front door slowly opening downstairs. Someone had entered the building. At that late hour, no one should have been there. Holding the sheriff's forgotten ledger tightly against her chest, Clara moved silently toward the narrow opening behind the bookcase and listened. Heavy footsteps crossed the waiting room floor beneath the attic. Then a man's voice drifted upward through the darkness. Calm, confident, familiar. Search every room, Victor Ashcroft said quietly. If Brooks hid anything in this building, tonight we finally find it. Clara pressed herself silently against the cedar wall inside the hidden chamber, while the sheriff's forgotten ledger rested tightly beneath her arm. Below, heavy boots echoed across the old depot floor with deliberate confidence. The men searching the building moved without hesitation, as though they already believed something valuable remained hidden there. Victor Ashcroft had not come hoping to discover a secret. He had come expecting to recover one. Clara carefully controlled her breathing as another lantern flickered somewhere beneath the attic floor. Shadows moved across the narrow gaps between the cedar boards. Dust drifted gently through the darkness while every sound seemed unnaturally loud inside the tiny concealed room. One of the men downstairs spoke first. Nothing in the dining room. Another answered from the stable entrance. Storage rooms are empty. Victor's calm voice interrupted them both. The sheriff visited this depot for years after everyone else stopped caring about it. Men like Nathaniel Brooks never wasted their time. Look harder. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. Nathaniel had been right. They had eventually realized the truth, even if they had never discovered precisely where he hid it. She slowly looked around the hidden chamber once more, searching for anything she might have overlooked before leaving. Near the work table stood a small cedar cabinet built neatly into the wall. She had assumed it contained empty shelves, but now, in the faint moonlight entering through a narrow roof vent, she noticed something unusual beneath the bottom shelf. A shallow drawer, almost perfectly blended into the surrounding wood. Kneeling carefully, she eased it open. Inside rested several folded railroad maps, a small brass key, and an envelope bearing only one handwritten sentence. For whoever finds the ledger. Clara unfolded the single page inside. Nathaniel's familiar handwriting appeared once again. If my ledger has survived, then those responsible have almost certainly continued searching for it. Never carry the original openly. They expect honesty to travel in plain sight. Let truth travel disguised instead. Beneath the note, Nathaniel had sketched a simple drawing of the depot itself, the attic, the hidden chamber, then another location, directly beneath the freight office floor. Clara frowned. She studied the drawing more carefully. A second compartment, entirely separate from the hidden attic room. Nathaniel had created more than one hiding place. Suddenly Victor's voice sounded much closer. "Check upstairs." The attic staircase creaked loudly beneath approaching footsteps. Clara immediately returned the maps and note to the drawer before slipping the brass key into her satchel. Holding the ledger tightly, she quietly examined the hidden chamber walls one final time. Another narrow opening caught her attention near the roofline. It appeared barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond it, she could just make out darkness leading toward the rear stable loft. Nathaniel had planned an escape route. Before she could move, the heavy bookcase outside scraped loudly across the attic floor. Someone had discovered the hidden mechanism. Lantern light spilled through the widening opening as one of Victor's men laughed quietly. "Found something." Clara moved instantly. Remaining inside the chamber meant certain discovery. She climbed silently through the narrow roof passage, carefully pulling the ledger behind her. Rough cedar beams scraped her shoulders while loose dust filled the cramped crawl space. Beneath her, voices echoed clearly inside the chamber she had just left. "There's a room back here," one man called. Victor entered moments later. Clara froze completely. She could hear every word. "Search everything," Victor ordered calmly. Drawers opened. Shelves emptied. Furniture scraped across the wooden floor. One man reported, "Nothing here except an old chair and work table." Another added, "Looks like somebody left years ago." Victor remained silent longer than the others. Finally, he spoke almost to himself. Nathaniel Brooks wasn't the kind of man who hid empty rooms. Clara carefully continued crawling through the narrow passage until cool night air suddenly touched her face. The hidden exit opened behind loose boards inside the abandoned hayloft above the stable. She eased herself outside and quietly replaced the weathered plank exactly as she had found it. Below, moonlight illuminated the stable yard where 3 horses waited beside the fence. Victor's men remained inside the depot searching room after room. None of them looked toward the loft. Clara studied the yard carefully. Climbing down the old ladder risked immediate discovery. Instead, she crossed slowly along the loft beams until reaching the rear wall where years earlier Thomas had installed a hay chute leading directly outside. The wooden slide still remained intact, though badly weathered. Holding the ledger securely beneath her coat, Clara carefully lowered herself onto the chute and quietly slid toward the ground behind the stable. Dry grass softened her landing. She paused, listening. The search inside the depot continued uninterrupted. No one had heard her escape. Staying near the building would be dangerous. Yet Nathaniel's drawing continued turning through her thoughts. A second hiding place beneath the freight office floor. If Victor failed to find the ledger tonight, he would almost certainly return again. The depot itself would never remain safe. Clara needed someone she could trust completely before deciding what to do next. Only one name came immediately to mind: Judge Henry Caldwell. Before retiring several years earlier, Caldwell had served alongside Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks during some of the territory's most difficult legal disputes. Thomas often described him as one of the last judges who believed justice mattered more than influence. Clara remembered visiting his small farmhouse once as a child. He lived nearly 10 miles outside Redstone Crossing beside Willow Creek. She looked toward the eastern horizon where the first faint hint of approaching dawn touched the sky. If she traveled immediately across the old wagon trails, she could reach Caldwell's farm before sunrise. Carefully keeping to the shadows, Clara slipped through the cottonwood trees surrounding the depot and disappeared into the sleeping prairie. Behind her, Victor Ashcroft finally emerged from the hidden chamber, carrying only frustration. He looked once more around the silent attic before quietly noticing something his men had overlooked. Fresh dust disturbed the edge of the old hayloft opening. He smiled very slowly. "She's already been here," he said. One of the men looked confused. "Did she find it?" Victor's eyes remained fixed upon the faint footprints leading toward the stable roof. "If she didn't," he answered softly, "she wouldn't have run." He stepped out onto the attic floor and looked toward the dark prairie stretching beyond Redstone Crossing. "Saddle the horses," one of the riders asked. "Where do we search first?" Victor calmly placed his gloves back onto his hands. "Not where she's hiding." His cold smile returned. "Where she'll go when she realizes she can't protect the truth alone." Clara Bennett reached Judge Henry Caldwell's farmhouse shortly after sunrise with dust covering her boots, exhaustion weighing upon every step, and Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks's forgotten ledger still hidden securely beneath her coat. Thin smoke drifted peacefully from the stone chimney, while chickens wandered freely through the small yard surrounded by apple trees and weathered split-rail fences. Nothing about the quiet homestead suggested danger, yet Clara instinctively studied every corner before approaching the porch. Thomas had always taught her never to assume peaceful places remained untouched by troubled men. Judge Caldwell himself opened the front door before she could knock twice. Though well into his 70s, he still carried himself with the quiet dignity that had earned respect throughout the territory. His silver hair had grown thinner with age, yet his sharp gray eyes missed very little. The moment he recognized Clara Bennett, concern replaced surprise. "Miss Bennett," he said softly, "you look as though you've walked all night." Clara managed a tired smile. "I have." Caldwell stepped aside immediately. "Then come inside before explaining why." The warmth of the little farmhouse wrapped gently around her as she entered. Books lined nearly every wall. Maps of surrounding counties rested neatly rolled inside wooden barrels beside the fireplace. A large oak desk stood beneath the front window covered with law journals, faded court records, and carefully sharpened pencils arranged with remarkable precision. Everything reflected the orderly mind of a man who believed truth deserved careful attention. Caldwell quietly poured fresh coffee before noticing Clara's trembling hands. "Someone is following you." It was not a question. Clara nodded. Without another word, she carefully removed the sheriff's forgotten ledger from beneath her coat and placed it gently upon the desk. The retired judge stared silently at the worn black leather cover. His face gradually lost all color. For several moments he simply rested one hand upon the book without opening it. Finally he whispered almost to himself, "Nathaniel." Clara watched him carefully. "You recognize it?" Caldwell nodded slowly. "I helped him purchase this ledger nearly 15 years ago." He looked toward her. "I believed it disappeared with him." Clara quietly explained everything from the auction, the hidden attic chamber, the search led by Victor Ashcroft, and Nathaniel's final instructions written inside the ledger. Caldwell listened without interrupting once. Only after she finished did he carefully untie the faded blue ribbon and begin reading. Nearly an hour passed inside complete silence, except for the turning of old pages. Sometimes Caldwell paused to reread particular entries. Other times he quietly removed spectacles from his face before looking toward the window as though remembering conversations held decades earlier. When he finally closed the ledger again, he exhaled slowly. Nathaniel knew. Clara frowned. Knew what? Caldwell gently rested both hands upon the cover. And he knew the corruption reached far beyond Redstone Crossing. Clara sat quietly. Caldwell continued. "I retired because I believed I was growing too old to fight powerful men." He smiled sadly. Nathaniel refused to retire because he believed truth deserved one more chance. Clara looked toward the ledger. Can this prove what Iron Ridge has done? Much more than that. Caldwell rose from his chair and walked toward a locked cabinet built into the far wall. Unlocking it with a small brass key, he removed an aged wooden box wrapped carefully inside canvas cloth. Returning to the desk, he placed it beside Nathaniel's ledger. "I hoped never to open this again." Inside rested dozens of neatly organized court transcripts, original witness statements, sworn affidavits, and official correspondence bearing territorial seals. Clara looked at him in surprise. "You've been keeping evidence too?" Caldwell nodded quietly. "Nathaniel asked me to." Clara scarcely breathed. "Then why didn't you expose them?" The old judge answered with remarkable honesty. "Because evidence without proof of the original fraud would only create suspicion. He gently touched the sheriff's ledger. This, his voice softened, is the missing piece. Together they spent the remainder of the morning, comparing Nathaniel's notes against Caldwell's preserved court records. Every major land theft recorded inside the ledger matched witness statements hidden inside the judge's box. Dates aligned perfectly, survey numbers matched, forged signatures appeared repeatedly across unrelated cases. Entire communities had quietly lost farms, ranches, mills, stores, churches, and public land through the same carefully organized deception stretching back almost 20 years. Clara suddenly recognized another name appearing repeatedly throughout both collections: Victor Ashcroft's father, Edwin Ashcroft. Caldwell noticed her expression. "You see it now." Clara nodded slowly. Victor didn't create the scheme. No. Caldwell looked thoughtfully toward the morning sunlight spilling across his desk. He inherited it. Nathaniel Brooks had spent years documenting not merely financial crimes, but the deliberate transfer of power from one dishonest generation to another. The railroad company changed names over time. Officials retired. Lawyers disappeared. Yet the same families quietly continued controlling the stolen property through newer corporations and carefully rewritten records. Clara closed the final court transcript. "How many families lost everything?" Caldwell answered after a long silence. "More than 80. The number settled heavily between them. 80 families. Hundreds of lives quietly altered because a handful of powerful men believed forgotten people would never discover forgotten records." Caldwell carefully reorganized every document before looking directly toward Clara. "Nathaniel left one instruction inside the ledger, didn't he?" Clara nodded. "He said to use it for restoration, not revenge." The judge smiled warmly. "Exactly the man I remember." Before either could speak further, hurried hoofbeats echoed outside the farmhouse. Both looked instinctively toward the front window. A young rider pulled sharply into the yard before jumping from his horse. It was Daniel Mercer, the postmaster's 18-year-old son from Redstone Crossing. He pounded urgently upon the front door. Caldwell opened it immediately. Daniel struggled to catch his breath. "Judge," he gasped, "they've arrested Mrs. Whitmore." Clara stepped forward. "Arrested? Why?" "Victor Ashcroft claims she helped you steal company property." Clara stared in disbelief. Daniel continued. "Half the town believes you're a fugitive now. They're saying the sheriff's office has a warrant for your arrest." Caldwell's expression hardened noticeably. "How quickly lies travel?" Daniel nodded. "They're searching every farmhouse between here and Redstone." Clara immediately understood Victor's strategy. Unable to recover the ledger directly, he intended to isolate her by turning honest people into frightened witnesses. Anyone helping her would risk arrest. Caldwell quietly closed the front door before returning to the desk. "He wants you to surrender before the truth reaches anyone powerful enough to stop him." Clara looked toward Nathaniel's ledger. "Then we take it somewhere he cannot control." Caldwell nodded. "The territorial Grand Circuit begins next week in Carson City." Clara recognized the name immediately. Every senior judge from 3 territories gathered there annually to review major legal disputes beyond local influence. Caldwell carefully placed Nathaniel's ledger beside his preserved court records inside the wooden evidence box. If these documents reach the Grand Circuit, he looked directly into Clara's eyes. Victor Ashcroft loses far more than stolen property. Clara quietly asked, "What does he lose?" Caldwell answered without hesitation. The entire lie his family spent 20 years building. Outside, distant hoofbeats echoed once more across the valley. This time, there were many more riders than before. Caldwell stepped cautiously toward the window. Through the trees he counted at least 8 mounted men approaching along the western road. At their head rode Victor Ashcroft himself. The hunt had reached the judge's doorstep. Judge Henry Caldwell quietly lowered the curtain after counting the riders approaching across the western pasture. 8 horses, Victor Ashcroft leading them. 2 county deputies rode beside him, while the remaining men wore plain work clothes, though every one of them carried himself like someone accustomed to taking orders rather than asking questions. Clara stood beside the old oak desk, with Nathaniel Brooks's forgotten ledger resting inside the evidence box. Fear touched her heart for only a moment before something stronger quietly replaced it. Nathaniel had not hidden the truth for 20 years so it could disappear again inside another farmhouse. Judge Caldwell calmly closed the wooden evidence box and secured the brass latch. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, There's something I never told Nathaniel. Clara looked toward him. What is it? He smiled faintly. This house wasn't built by a judge. Clara frowned. Caldwell walked toward the large stone fireplace and removed an ordinary-looking iron poker resting beside the hearth. Instead of tending the fire, he inserted the poker into a tiny opening between two stones near the floor. A soft metallic click echoed beneath the room. Slowly, almost silently, part of the bookcase along the eastern wall swung inward, revealing a narrow stone passage disappearing beneath the farmhouse. Clara stared in amazement. "There's another room?" Caldwell nodded. "An old escape tunnel." He smiled gently. "Built during the territorial disputes long before I ever lived here." Clara looked toward the approaching riders outside. "Will it take us out?" "Nearly a mile." Caldwell lifted the evidence box. "Straight to Willow Creek." Before stepping into the hidden passage, he paused beside his writing desk. Taking a blank sheet of paper, he wrote several lines quickly, before folding the note neatly beneath an ink bottle. Clara looked curiously toward him. "What's that?" "An invitation." Caldwell smiled. "Victor expects frightened people to run." His eyes brightened slightly. "Sometimes the greatest surprise comes from someone who stays behind." Heavy knocks suddenly shook the front door. Victor Ashcroft's voice echoed clearly through the farmhouse. "Judge Caldwell." The elderly judge calmly replaced the curtain before answering loudly enough to be heard. "One moment." He turned back toward Clara. "Go." Clara hesitated. "I can't leave you." Caldwell placed one gentle hand upon her shoulder. "Nathaniel trusted me to protect the evidence." Then he looked directly into her eyes. "Today I trust you." Clara slowly nodded. She accepted the evidence box and stepped into the narrow stone tunnel. Before disappearing into the darkness, she looked back one final time. Judge Caldwell stood calmly beside the fireplace, exactly as though expecting ordinary visitors rather than powerful men searching for evidence capable of destroying everything they had built. He smiled warmly. "Tell the truth exactly as Nathaniel wrote it." The hidden door closed softly behind her. Moments later, Caldwell unlocked the front entrance. Victor Ashcroft removed his hat politely. "Judge." Caldwell returned the greeting just as courteously. "Mr. Ashcroft." Victor glanced calmly around the farmhouse. "We're searching for Clara Bennett." Caldwell nodded thoughtfully. "Are you?" "She stole company property." "Did she?" Victor's pleasant expression never changed. "You've always enjoyed asking questions." Caldwell smiled. "Occupational habit." Victor stepped inside, accompanied by two deputies. "May we search the premises?" Caldwell looked toward the warrant resting inside Victor's hand. "You certainly may." While the men carefully examined every room above ground, Clara quietly followed the narrow tunnel beneath the farmhouse. The cool stone passage sloped gently downward before turning east beneath enormous oak roots. Old lantern brackets still lined the walls, though none had been lit for decades. Caldwell clearly maintained the tunnel in secret. Fresh air drifted steadily from somewhere ahead, carrying the scent of running water. Nearly 15 minutes later, faint daylight appeared beyond another concealed doorway hidden among thick willow trees beside the creek. Clara emerged carefully into the morning sunlight. Willow Creek flowed peacefully past smooth stones as though untouched by the struggle, unfolding only a short distance away. She looked back once toward the hidden entrance before continuing east along the riverbank. Behind her, inside the farmhouse, Victor's search produced nothing. Every cabinet, bookshelf, storage room, and cellar stood exactly as expected. One deputy finally returned to the front room. Nothing. Victor remained strangely calm. His eyes slowly wandered across Caldwell's desk until they settled upon the folded note beneath the ink bottle. "May I?" he asked politely. Caldwell nodded. Victor unfolded the paper and read silently. For the first time that morning, his expression changed. The note contained only one sentence. "Honest records always travel farther than dishonest men." Victor smiled despite himself, before carefully replacing the paper. "Nathaniel wrote that." Caldwell answered quietly. "No." He looked directly into Victor's eyes. "Thomas Bennett did." Silence settled heavily between them. Victor finally placed his hat back upon his head. "You know she'll never outrun this." Caldwell walked slowly toward the window overlooking the pasture. "She doesn't have to." Victor frowned. "Meaning?" The old judge turned calmly toward him. "Truth has already left." Victor's eyes narrowed. He suddenly understood. They had arrived minutes too late. Clara already carried the evidence beyond local control. Without another word, he strode outside and mounted his horse. Carson City, he muttered to himself. One deputy looked puzzled. Sir? Victor gathered the reins tightly. She's going to the Grand Circuit. The riders thundered away almost immediately, racing east across the prairie. Caldwell watched them disappear before quietly returning inside his empty farmhouse. He smiled gently as he poured himself another cup of coffee. Ride safely, Miss Bennett, he whispered. Several days later, Clara reached Carson City after traveling almost entirely by secondary freight roads, sleeping inside abandoned churches, friendly barns, and one small mission house whose elderly caretaker asked no questions beyond whether she needed a warm meal. Nathaniel's evidence box never left her side. The nearer she came to the territorial capital, the more wagons crowded the roads. Judges, lawyers, surveyors, merchants, ranchers, and elected officials from across 3 territories all traveled toward the annual Grand Circuit. No single county sheriff possessed authority there. No local magistrate controlled the proceedings. For the first time since discovering the hidden chamber inside the Stagecoach depot, Clara felt genuine hope. Early on the morning the Grand Circuit opened, she climbed the broad stone steps of the territorial hall, carrying nothing except the weathered evidence box. Marble columns rose above hundreds of gathered citizens waiting to witness the opening session. Court officers moved steadily through the crowd, while clerks organized stacks of official documents. Clara quietly approached the reception desk. My name is Clara Bennett. The elderly clerk looked up politely. How may the court assist you? Clara gently placed the evidence box upon the polished counter. I need to present evidence directly to the Grand Circuit. The clerk glanced toward the ordinary wooden box before asking routinely, regarding what matter? Clara slowly lifted the brass latch. Resting neatly inside lay Nathaniel Brooks's forgotten ledger, Judge Caldwell's preserved court records, original land surveys, sworn witness statements, and decades of carefully hidden truth. The clerk looked down only briefly before his eyes widened dramatically. He immediately closed the lid again and stood. Please wait here. Moments later, 3 senior judges emerged from the chamber itself. Without a single question, they escorted Clara inside. Outside, unknown to everyone entering the courthouse, Victor Ashcroft had just arrived at the opposite end of the square. He looked toward the massive stone building and saw the great courtroom doors slowly closing behind Clara Bennett. For the second time, he had reached the truth, only moments too late. The story that powerful men believed they had buried inside a forgotten stagecoach depot was finally about to be heard by the one court they could neither intimidate nor control. Inside the Grand Circuit courtroom, silence settled naturally as the 3 senior judges carefully examined the contents of Nathaniel Brooks's forgotten ledger. Clara stood quietly before them without embellishment or accusation. She simply answered every question with steady honesty, explaining how she had purchased the abandoned stagecoach depot for $5, how the hidden chamber had been concealed behind the sliding bookcase in the attic, how Nathaniel's investigation had remained untouched for nearly 20 years, and how Judge Henry Caldwell had preserved matching court records without ever knowing whether the missing proof would someday appear. No dramatic speeches filled the chamber. The evidence itself spoke with remarkable clarity. Every page inside the sheriff's ledger matched Caldwell's preserved affidavits. Survey numbers aligned perfectly. Witness statements confirmed altered property boundaries. Forged signatures repeated themselves across counties separated by hundreds of miles. Original maps contradicted the official records currently controlling thousands of acres of frontier land. Before midday, the presiding justice quietly ordered the courtroom cleared, except for senior investigators, territorial auditors, and the chief recorder. Clara waited patiently in a nearby chamber, while officials spent hours comparing Nathaniel's original entries against government archives brought from the capital. By late afternoon, the courtroom doors reopened. The presiding justice rose slowly before delivering one of the most significant rulings ever heard within the Grand Circuit. Every property transfer identified inside Nathaniel Brooks's ledger would immediately be suspended pending territorial review. Independent surveyors would restore original land boundaries wherever fraud could be proven. County recorders named within the investigation would be removed from office while criminal inquiries began. Existing warrants issued against Clara Bennett were declared fraudulent and permanently dismissed. Judge Henry Caldwell's preserved evidence would become part of the official territorial archive. Most importantly, the court recognized Nathaniel Brooks's investigation as authentic and ordered every affected family to receive a complete review of their property claims. The announcement spread through Carson City before sunset. Newspapers hurriedly printed special editions describing the extraordinary discovery inside an abandoned stagecoach depot. Telegraph operators worked through the night, transmitting summaries across neighboring territories. Ranchers, merchants, ministers, teachers, and ordinary families quietly gathered around courthouse steps reading lists of reopened land cases. Many recognized familiar family names. They believed history had already forgotten. Victor Ashcroft attempted one final legal challenge the following morning, arguing that decades had passed and existing ownership should remain undisturbed regardless of earlier mistakes. The Grand Circuit rejected the petition unanimously. The presiding justice answered with only one sentence: "Time may conceal injustice, but it never transforms it into justice." Victor offered no further argument. Within weeks, investigators uncovered additional records hidden inside company offices, confirming nearly every major entry Nathaniel Brooks had recorded years earlier. Edwin Ashcroft's carefully constructed network collapsed under the weight of authentic documents, sworn testimony, and restored public records. Several officials quietly resigned before formal charges could even be filed. Others faced public hearings. Yet Clara noticed something remarkable throughout the proceedings. Judge Caldwell insisted repeatedly that every decision focus first upon restoring innocent families rather than punishing guilty ones. Nathaniel's final instruction remained at the heart of every conversation: restoration before revenge. Because of that choice, dozens of families recovered homes, ranches, stores, mills, and grazing rights, without becoming trapped inside years of bitter retaliation. Children returned to farms their grandparents believed permanently lost. Elderly settlers finally saw family deeds corrected before the end of their lives. Churches regained stolen land. Public wells once controlled by private companies again belonged to entire communities. Redstone crossings slowly changed in ways no one believed possible. The abandoned stagecoach depot itself became the first property officially returned to Clara Bennett through the Grand Circuit's restoration order. When the territorial clerk presented the corrected deed, Clara smiled gently before asking a surprising question. "May I place one condition upon accepting it?" The clerk looked puzzled. "What condition?" Clara answered quietly. "The depot should never belong only to me." Several months later, after consultation with the town council and territorial officials, the property officially became the Redstone Community Depot, held in public trust for travelers, local gatherings, historical records, and future generations. Clara accepted the role of caretaker rather than owner. She believed buildings remembered people because people chose to remember one another within them. The townspeople restored the depot together. Carpenters replaced broken beams while preserving every original board still strong enough to remain. Blacksmiths repaired old iron hinges. Ranchers donated lumber. Schoolchildren polished lanterns and washed windows. Elderly women carefully stitched new curtains matching those Eleanor Bennett once hung beside the dining room. Above the restored waiting room, Clara reopened the hidden attic chamber exactly as Nathaniel Brooks had left it. Nothing inside became a tourist attraction. Instead, the small cedar room remained a quiet memorial, dedicated to every ordinary person who chose honesty when dishonesty promised easier rewards. Nathaniel's sheriff's badge rested inside a simple glass case beside his leather ledger. Judge Henry Caldwell's preserved court records occupied neighboring shelves. Thomas Bennett's old pocketknife and Eleanor's faded handkerchief found places there as well. Gentle reminders that history often survives because ordinary families quietly protect it, without ever expecting recognition. Visitors frequently asked Clara what the greatest treasure inside the depot had been. Some guessed the sheriff's badge. Others believed it was the ledger itself. Clara always smiled before answering. Neither. Curious children usually asked the same question afterward. Then what was it? She would glance upward toward the attic, where sunlight drifted softly through the old roof beams, before replying, "The courage of people who believed the truth was worth protecting, even if they never lived long enough to see it, believed." Years later, travelers passing through Redstone Crossing often stopped at the restored depot without realizing they were entering one of the most important buildings in the territory. They found warm meals waiting inside, fresh coffee beside the fireplace, local children listening to frontier stories, and Clara Bennett greeting strangers with the same quiet kindness Eleanor had once shown every weary traveler stepping through those doors. The depot had become exactly what Thomas always believed journeys required, not merely a place to arrive, but a place where hope could begin again. Looking back upon everything that happened, we remember that Clara Bennett never set out searching for hidden treasure. She simply refused to abandon a place everyone else believed had become worthless. In doing so, she uncovered something far greater than forgotten records. She discovered that truth often survives in silence, waiting patiently for someone willing to restore what others have dismissed. $5 purchased an abandoned Stagecoach depot. Quiet perseverance restored an entire community. Perhaps that has always been the real measure of value. Not the price we pay for forgotten things, but the faith we show by believing they still matter. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. If Clara Bennett's story reminded you that overlooked places and overlooked people can still change the future, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments about a time you discovered unexpected value where others saw none. If you enjoy slow, cinematic Western frontier stories filled with mystery, resilience, and hope, consider subscribing so you won't miss our next journey across the American frontier. Until next time, stay close, take care of one another, and never underestimate the quiet power of restoring what the world has forgotten.